Welcome, everybody. My name is Nabil Fahel, and I'm the Director of Partnerships here at Terminal. I have the pleasure of introducing today's moderator and MC, but before I do, I just wanted to mention a few things for the benefit of our live stream audience. If you have any questions for today's speakers, please put them in our chat box on our live stream page at www.terminal.io/livestream, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. For those not familiar with Terminal, we're a remote teams company where top engineers meet fast-growing companies. We bring global opportunities to your doorstep to help companies access the best talent wherever that might be. After all, talent is universal, but opportunity is not. If you'd like to learn more about job opportunities at Terminal, just head over to terminal.io/openings. We're hiring is always on. Okay, that said, I'd like to introduce two of our speakers today, and I'll start first with Samuel Legg. Samuel Legg graduated from the University of Waterloo with a degree in nanotechnology engineering and management science. During school, Sam was intensely focused on scientific research as well as trying his hand at co-founding two businesses. Sam went on to advise hundreds of startups on topics such as fundraising, strategy, product development at Communitech, where he helped launch the seed accelerator known as REV. Sam then joined Thalmic Labs in 2015 as an early employee working on a stealth smart glasses product. Thalmic Labs rebranded to North as they scaled their team to hundreds of employees after raising about $200 million in financing from some of the world's top investors. Sam built and led product teams at North as they developed a category-creating product, Focals, the world's first everyday smart glasses. In 2020, North was acquired by Google, Google's first fully remote acquisition, and today Sam serves as a product manager level 6 at Google, focusing on devices and services. He also volunteers his time helping support startups across Canada through efforts such as Waterloo Alumni Angels. And Sam is an avid traveler, hiker, explorer, and most people consider him very punny. Okay, and next, of course, we have the guest of honor, Terminal Executive in Residence, Adil Ajmal, who is a highly consumer-focused engineering and product leader with a strong track record of building top-tier products and high-performing organizations at companies ranging from small startups all the way to large publicly traded companies, including Intuit and Amazon. Adil is currently the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Product Officer at Fandom. In his role, he's focused on increasing fan engagement across Fandom's existing platform, as well as leading the development of new subscription products, gaming tools, data services, and more. If you're not familiar with Fandom, it's the world's #1 source for entertainment storylines, characters, levels, and lore, with over 300 million unique monthly visitors and 250,000 communities. Adil has previously held leadership positions at Lending Home, Amazon, 10 Marks Education, Posterous, Intuit, United Online, Homestead Technologies, and Razorfish. Adil graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science from the University of Texas at Austin. And when he's not working, Adil could be found skiing with his 2 sons, riding motorcycles, or doing training with his German Shepherd dog. Thank you both very much for joining us here at Terminal today. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Samuel, and thank you for moderating and emceeing today's program.
Awesome. Thank you so much for such a detailed introduction, Nabil. Welcome, everyone. I think I got my whole background there all in 1 minute. It was awesome. Okay, so as Nabil mentioned, I'm a product manager. I've been working with lots of different size teams and businesses over the past couple of years. I'm super excited to talk to Adil about his varied experience building teams. He's obviously an expert in this area. And for my own curiosity, I'm probably going to just guide this discussion a little bit more into how he thinks about building, executing, and leading high-performance product teams with a couple of things we might touch on in terms of common organizational questions for companies at different stages of growth. But I'd love to maybe include as much as possible from the audience and any questions that you want to hear answered. And please feel free to chime in, and we'll take them as we go and let the conversation evolve from there. So first, I don't know if you want to touch on anything else on your background, Adil, before we get going after that amazing introduction from Nabil, but I'll hand it over to you for an intro if you have anything to add.
No, I think Nabil covered way more than I would have covered anyway. I'm just passionate about building consumer products. I usually like to build things that I can use or my friends and family can use. That ends up being one of my litmus tests in terms of how I pick products that I want to go and work on.
That's awesome. So maybe let's just dive into that passion for a second. I know that when we first met, you mentioned that you were a huge sci-fi fan. So I'll have to ask the question, Star Trek or Star Wars, and why?
Age-old question, right? But I have a very definitive answer for that. It's absolutely Star Trek. Not to say that I don't like Star Wars. Big fan of that as well. But I grew up with Star Trek. My mom got me started on the reruns of the original series, and then it was just every Star Trek thing from there. Like every single series, every movie, books, and so on. So it's absolutely a huge fan.
So how do you think about the latest Star Trek content coming out these days?
I actually like it. So the cool thing is I got my kids started on the latest content. I tried to get them started on the old one, and I wasn't really able to get as much traction. But I got them started on Picard and then Discovery, and we're all eagerly awaiting the next season for Discovery coming up, and hopefully Picard sometime next year as well. So I'm super excited about it.
That's awesome. And so I know that like Fandom. Go for it.
There's supposed to be a movie in the works eventually as well, with chance of Quentin Tarantino actually directing it and stuff. So we'll see if that actually comes to fruition or not. But that would be really cool.
I'd be really interested to see the Quentin Tarantino combo with Star Trek.
I know, right?
That's hard. Hard for me, but I'll have to see it when it comes.
Yeah.
Cool. So I know at Fandom, your team there really works on fostering and supporting all these fantasy worlds that exist in society today. So maybe just out of like my curiosity, what is your favorite fantasy world?
If it wasn't if I didn't think about the Star Trek universe, then the next one is Lord of the Rings. Having grown up with those books and seen the movies like too many times, countless times, basically. It's definitely one of my favorite worlds. And then of course if you start taking it further on the sci-fi side, then the MCU. DC is okay, but I think way bigger MCU fan than the DC universe. And then Game of Thrones is limited, but actually it's interesting. My introduction to what used to be fandom back in the time was through the Game of Thrones wiki way back in the day when I started watching that, and I wanted to know more about it. And Google took me to what was at that point called Wikia, which later got rebranded as Fandom. So I have a soft spot in my heart for that word as well.
Yeah, I mean, definitely on my side, I definitely credit Wikipedia getting me through my engineering degree. I don't think without it I'd ever have graduated school. But yeah, could you give us a little more info on like what the story of Fandom is up until now and kind of where it's headed in the future?
Sure, absolutely. It's Wikipedia is awesome, right? It's really changed the paradigm in terms of how encyclopedias existed. And Jimmy, who started Wikipedia, is also the co-founder of Fandom. It started as this thing called Wiki Series, similar to Yahoo's GeoCities, and then got the name changed to Wikia, and then a few years back changed to Fandom. The way I think of it, and I probably oversimplify this a bit more in terms of how Jimmy thought about it at that point, is I think about Fandom as the Wikipedia of the virtual worlds. So if you think about the actual Wikipedia, it's really a replacement for the encyclopedia, right? Even though it's user-generated content, but you expect it to be factual content. And so when you think about Fandom, it's that same concept. We are the largest collection of fan-generated content on the web, but we treat the virtual worlds as real worlds. And so, let's say if you were going back to Game of Thrones, and you look for Jon Snow, Wikipedia itself would tell you that Jon Snow is a character from so-and-so book, and this is Kit Harington is the actor that plays it. But then on Fandom, we would treat Jon Snow as a real person in that world, and you'd have all sorts of information around him, way more than you'd probably ever want to know. And so that we end up being exactly like Wikipedia, but just for that virtual world. That's how it grew. In terms of where it's growing, we are more than just reference content at this point. We've got a few different products and business lines at Fandom. One of our really exciting and upcoming products is Dungeons and Dragons Beyond, which is a digital tool set and the virtual game space for Dungeons and Dragons. That's been growing really, really fast for us with tons of passionate fans. We also acquired a company called Screen Junkies a few years back. They create these videos called Honest Trailers, which are really fun. If you haven't watched them before, I highly recommend going and checking them out. We just won a Webby Award for for the nth time again last week for that. So it's really cool content. And then we recently acquired another company in England called Fanatical, which is on the gaming commerce side. And so we're trying to do more commerce, fan-related commerce on our site as well. And in terms of where we're going, we will continue to create more services for our fans, more utilities for our fans, both in terms of creating new content, as well as consuming content and services that are related to celebrating their fandoms. And I'm super excited about that. Fandom's got a very, very interesting role to play in our lives as fans, and I'm thrilled to be part of the team that gets to build new features on it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I didn't know that the Honest Trailers team had joined you guys. I've watched them for years, so super excited to hear about that, as well as like I'm now thinking back to the days of when I was watching Game of Thrones for the first time and trying to keep track of all the family trees. Now I remember heavily going over to Wikipedia to check out all the different, who's related to who and who's married to what and who's killed what. So definitely appreciate the value that you're offering us through that experience. Yeah.
So, yeah, it is definitely very cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so I'm going to segue into a little bit more boring topic, but topical for the conversation today. I thought we could just kind of kick it off by first of all talking about a little top of mind question when it comes to high performing teams, which is the new reality of working from home. We're doing this remotely, which is not ideal for all the obvious reasons. So I'd love to just kind of start and talk to you about, you've got a pretty large set of tips and tricks for teams that you've shared over the years, whether it's in blog posts or in different forums, related to building teams before work from home was a set in reality. And I know that there was a distributed team before COVID existed, but it's really become like an ever-present thing in every single technology worker's life. So I'd love to just get your sense on like what has changed with that reality. Do you kind of see any sort of things that have changed how you think about building teams when it comes to distributed work? Let's just start there.
Sure. A lot has changed over the last year, Sam, and I think it's reinforced the nature of remote and distributed work significantly. And I'm actually, really happy about that. I don't think any of us is planning on going back to the traditional 5 days in the office anytime soon, or ever for that matter. We at Fandom definitely don't plan to do that. We're planning on going back, with a hybrid model and actually even changing how we think about, a headquarters structure, which we're moving away from in our company. But going back to a few more specific things around distributed teams or remote teams. It's created a lot of opportunities for individuals as well as companies, and it highlights some very interesting challenges as well that people generally don't think about. So from an opportunity perspective, both as individuals, we have access to way more interesting jobs outside of our local area. So that's a huge plus point, and same for the companies, right? Like either hiring folks in different states or cities or even through different countries where, by utilizing companies like Terminal, having access to that talent has become way, way easier. Over the last year, people have also proven that remote teams can work really nicely, given that every single person has pretty much been remote and distributed. And we've also been figuring out how to still keep teams engaged, which ends up being a real challenge when you've got a majority of your people in an office and one poor person or a few people just sitting in front of the screen and missing out on everything else that's happening in that workplace, right? Like all the hallway conversations or a lot of the unofficial things that may be happening. And so from that perspective, teams have been figuring out so many different ways to overcome that piece. And that's been a positive. In fact, multiple startups have been coming out in terms of how they actually solve those problems from a social perspective. So, we just created a new market for, for those tools that's now on steroids. So that's been great. Better planning tools have been coming up, because one of the things that does take a bigger hit is planning, especially when you're thinking about it from a product and business planning perspective, when you're doing it in a very distributed way versus just being able to get people in a room, or in a place together for a few hours. That's an interesting challenge that I think people are getting better at solving. A few other things that have been challenging. Remote work has been easier for more senior folks since they can be more self-directed. But now, as everybody's been remote, companies have been figuring out how to still onboard their newer employees who may be coming out of school, who may not have been as used to that distributed team, and who are looking at that social aspect of the company as well around them, because you get to make some of your best friends at work, like when you're starting out. And that ends up becoming harder when there are no social activities and your only interaction is through Zoom. So one of the key things there, as travel starts opening up, is going to be still having focus on bringing people together from time to time with a purpose, so that they can still continue to establish those bonds and continue to have fun and have those long-lasting relationships. I think that's one thing that companies should continue to spend money on, and not just think of travel as something that's completely gone away. Like, again, for Fandom, we do plan to bring our teams together from time to time with a purpose. And that's something that's extremely important for us. Another thing that's actually that people don't think about much at all, I, for one, personally have not thought about this too much in the past either, is around the cultural differences when you're building teams that are geographically distributed. For example, Silicon Valley is an interesting case where you've got a certain culture. You've got people who are more entrepreneurial, who are basically less risk averse because the environment supports that. Now, when you add somebody in a different location, a different country, for example, where the society may be more risk averse, it's not to say that everybody out of that region is going to be, more or less risk averse, but there's a cultural constraint that comes in, which you can work around. You're always going to find outliers there as well, but knowing the constraints that come with certain cultures and locations is a good thing to know as you're putting teams together. Because once you know it, you can work around it and you can encourage people. So, as another example on top of that is folks in the US and Canada, when they're growing up in the education system here, are encouraged to ask questions and be more inquisitive. There are other cultures where asking questions is actually frowned upon. And in fact, when people in those cultures are growing up in their academic systems, they're actually given negative reinforcement when they're asking a lot of questions. So they end up not asking them. So now when you start mixing a team together without knowing some of those cultural differences, it's harder for you to solve. You may just say, why is this person on my team never asking any questions? But and why are they only coming to meet me eventually when something is missed, but they're not necessarily giving, they're not giving updates the same way everybody else on the team is. Why are they not as vocal? But once you figure out that that may be a cultural difference, you may be able to actually help them overcome that, or create your processes in a different way, which still helps them to participate in your team the same way, but by employing different methodologies for communication. So these are some of the things that will start becoming more important as you start going more distributed, especially globally, and not just within the country that you're in. And that's a nuance that people generally don't realize till they start creating those type of teams, or they start investing the time to understand historical context and cultural differences.
Yeah, it sounds like there's going to be, some really brand new organizational muscles that'll have to be built over the coming years to support these very distributed teams.
Exactly.
Yeah, and with that, you mentioned the hallway conversation topic, which I'd love to just go back to for a second. As a product manager, I find that, for the most part, my job has been, roughly the same since we went to a distributed model. One of the things that I do really miss, though, and I feel that it's something that, I almost get my best work done in sometimes, is those conversations, right before a meeting or right after a meeting, just kind of getting a greater context of how people are feeling about certain things, or what really is underlying, an issue that we're currently debating. So are there anything like specifically that you've done or your team has done that you're excited about to kind of recreate the magic of those hallways conversations? I'd love to hear that if you have any suggestions.
Yeah, our teams are trying different things, and I would be remiss because I'm going to forget the names of some of the tools that they're trying. But in addition to just having, just trying to move some of those conversations over, Slack channels, which is, again, a hit or miss. I think one of the other things that people have been trying is actually keeping their cameras on for certain teams. So instead of sequentially setting up Zoom meetings, which ends up being, you always have to plan it. It's very structured. Basically, just creating an environment where you're still around people and your cameras and mics are still turned on, and you can just jump into conversations. And not doing that the entire day, but at least setting some time aside during your day or during your week where different teams and different individuals can just do that. So that's been one way of replicating it. We've had other meetings that have been a bit more structured, of just bringing cross-functional people together without necessarily an agenda to again hang out and try to recreate that. So these are all, again, different things that are being experimented by our different teams, some with success, some with a little less success. So I don't think this is a completely solved problem yet. And it's one that is extremely important because I miss those hallway conversations. I'm very much looking forward to going back to the office at least a couple of days a week once we start going back in a few months, just to have those interactions. But the reality is that now, as we're going to have more distributed teams, we need to solve this, because even if I go back to the San Francisco office, or if I'm traveling to any of our other offices, there's still going to be many of our employees who are just working entirely remotely. And we have to create an environment and culture where they are included in the same way, they have the same opportunities to be able to participate in these conversations, and that being in an office does not end up creating a significant advantage for people that are there and creates categories and classes of your employees. That is one thing that we are extremely focused on. So for example, even as we go back now, we are not doing any of our all hands meetings in person. We want to give everybody the same leverage in those meetings. And so for our exec team meeting, we do that, we do that remotely. For my staff meeting, we do that remotely even when we go back to the office. For our tech all hands, for our company all hands, all of those are now distributed just so that everybody has an equal footing there. So those are some of the explicit things that we're trying to do. Another one is less about collaboration, but I mentioned the headquarters thing. We are explicitly now saying that we're not going to have a headquarters for the company at all, which means you can't be attached to an office and have any additional advantage to somebody who's either remote or in another office. And the exec team will actually travel and spend more time across different offices, on a routine basis versus just being in one place. So, and then I think the other one, hallway conversations, there's only so much you can replicate virtually. So that thing that I mentioned around bringing people back for, with a purpose and creating those type of environments, and opportunities is extremely, extremely important, and not just in a structured way, right? Like you can bring people together and basically let those things happen organically. So we'll be experimenting with that a lot more once we can start traveling.
Yeah, there's going to be just so many different types of models that are going to be tried. It'll be really interesting to see kind of what works, what doesn't, and who becomes like the thought leader in this area. Because I'm sure there's, like you mentioned, a whole industry that's going to grow up just based out of this new reality.
Totally.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So pivot a little bit to some more topics that you've kind of discussed in the past. I'd love to just kind of get a little deeper on that, and also for the audience here who hasn't read those posts that you've made. So you had this really interesting concept that I thought was worth discussing a little bit more around, the common fallacies that teams have when it comes to building product development teams. So first, let's touch on that, and then we can dig a little deeper on each of those.
Yeah, I think one of the first ones ends up being if you just hire a bunch of smart people, you can go and solve any problem. I used to believe that too. I think when for the longest time, because you'd hear it and it makes sense. Yeah, put a bunch of smart people together in a room, and I'm sure you can pretty much go and do anything. But I think a few things that are extremely key. One is from a team perspective. You could have, folks that are smart and well-intentioned, but if they don't actually get along with each other, they're not going to be a productive team. And a team that works well together will go much, much further than a team, no matter how smart, that's not as effective, right? So, that's a simple one. But another one that people also don't think about, you can be really smart, but if you, from a product perspective, if you don't have empathy for your user or the person that you're trying to solve a problem for, you're not necessarily going to come up with that best solution for them. You may think about something that makes sense to you, but if you can't put yourselves in that user's shoes, and really look at the problem the way they look at it, your solution is much less likely to be adopted by them and actually make a difference for them. Whereas it may still be a good solution, just not for that for that user if you're not if you don't have empathy. So those end up being like a couple of main ones. Another one ends up another one around, if you hire the same type of people, you don't end up having diversity of any kind, right? Diversity of thought, diversity of experiences. And that's a real challenge. So, and this is a major problem for smaller companies, young startups that are just starting out, because let's say if you've got young founders, the access to talent that they generally have is their friends or other people that are within that same group. So you end up bringing a bunch of you end up skewing more to a particular archetype. And that may be okay for starting to get you off the ground, but then your viewpoint is generally also very skewed in terms of how you solve a particular problem or how you build a system. So let's say from a pure technical perspective, it's very different to build and design an architecture to solve a 0 to 1 problem versus a 1 to 10 or 10 to 100 or or 100 to 1,000 and so on. And so if you've actually never experienced scale, the way you start building that system out from the very start is going to is going to have to be redone pretty quickly. At the same time, you can't just plan for it to serve 10 million users from the get-go, right? There has to be some balance. So having a diversity of experience in your team there helps with that significantly. Otherwise, you end up having a lot more churn when you're having to go back and redo things. It slows you down in the long run much more. So those are some of the common ones that come to my mind as I think through it, and they're easy to overcome once you can understand the challenges that they bring.
Yeah, all those points really resonate with me. I'm curious as a leader how you think about encouraging your teams on that first point. So I'd love to kind of just get a better sense for how you tactically are actually helping your team say, hey, hiring the smartest person is not always the best decision. We need to have a balance of someone who's capable of doing the job, but also someone who, like you said, is able to develop empathy for your customers or is just generally a good teammate. So are there certain things that you work with your team on to kind of encourage that in the interview and the hiring process?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And it's, and it applies to pretty much teams across the board, whether you're, whether you're starting out, whether you're a larger company. And it's about really defining what are the things that you're looking for in a person. For example, I think the smartest word, the smartest person ends up being more of a buzzword, right? Generally you are looking for people that are capable and that are intelligent. So that's not mutually exclusive with anything else. What you really have to focus on is what are the other experiences and competencies that you're looking for in a person? And then what are the values that you want that person to bring to your team? And if you can align on those things, then it's much easier to have a good, well-structured recruiting process to bring in the right type of candidates that are going to be accretive to your team, accretive to your company, versus just trying to see if they can solve a particular problem or not, or whether they're good to talk to or not. This is where culture actually ends up becoming a very interesting challenge. Culture is you can define culture in many different ways. It can be very ambiguous. Values, however, can be defined in a much better way and can be can be clearer, and people can resonate with them. And you may come from different cultures, but you may have very shared values. And so being able to define both competencies, functional competencies that you need for the role, versus the values that you want to instill in your team, that you want your company and team to operate by. Defining those two things will always help you bring in much stronger candidates versus just focusing on a technical competency or a single functional competency or just problem solving skills. And again, those things are not mutually exclusive, but having a better definition of what you're looking for will generally help. And this is where sorry, just to finish that, the other thing that comes in here, from a values perspective, because technical competencies you can, let's say, test for in certain ways. Values are generally harder, and so that's where I think the STAR methodology comes in for interviewing, where the idea is that past behavior is usually the best predictor of future behavior. And so you can, you don't have to give them brain teasers and things like that. You can actually dive into how they've dealt with previous experiences in their life and draw conclusions from that to see how they're going to work out in the future.
And so is that kind of that last point there, is that kind of how you hope that teams kind of figure out those alignments on values, is through kind of investigating people's experiences and asking deeper and deeper questions about those experiences to understand does that person fit? Is that kind of how you think about it?
Yeah, so what we end up doing is we end up defining a set of values that we want to test for, let's say across the company. And then, we'll divide some of those values across different interviewers, and we'll even help them with sample questions for each of the values. And those are just samples, right? So they can use those or they can come up with their, additional questions. But the idea is that you can then comprehensively check for a few of the key values that are important for you as a team or as a company. And different people can dive deeper on those in addition to the functional competencies. In fact, even on the functional and technical competencies, one approach is to be able to test people on it. So let's say, if you're doing a problem-solving exercise or if you're doing a coding exercise, that's one specific way of going about it. And it's a good tool to have, as part of that mix. Another way of also testing for functional competencies or even technical competencies is to use some of the STAR methodology and diving deeper into their past experiences and going deeper and deeper and seeing how they can actually talk about their work. Can they defend it if you're giving feedback on it, or if you're throwing curveballs at them? So and you're talking about a real thing. It's something that they've done. In fact, one of the other interesting things that comes in there is if you're hiring somebody senior, for example, you expect them to have solved a certain level of complex problems in the past. And complexity or scale are relative. So they may be very different for very different people. And so when you actually dive through their past experiences and keep going through different layers, it can really give you a very good idea in terms of if their large scale is similar to what you consider large scale, or if what they think is complex is simple to you. And those are really good things to be able to align on and measure as you're bringing in candidates.
Yeah, I really like that framework. Cool. Okay, so now that we're talking about go for it.
Sorry, just as an example, so this is less related to recruiting, but more related to promotions, for example. So Amazon has this general rule around promotions in engineering, that you don't get promoted to the next level till your work, your project has seen the test of time. So the test of time for them is scale. So you have to go through one peak period at least, and your work needs to stand on its own before you're even put up for promotion in that next cycle. And given that the expectation is the same across the board, it's fair, for everybody. But then everybody has a similar understanding of what scale and complexity means across the board.
Okay. I have an interesting question on that topic specifically, because being now working at Google, I see this in a couple of different ways. So how do you as an organization kind of optimize for someone who's, or optimize for, engineering promotion, or like, basically recognition of contribution to the company based on, how well their product does versus, the chances they took potentially to, build that product itself? Because I think there's like, depending on the business you're in, obviously, there are, a lot of projects that have a chance of becoming something, but, taking that chance is almost in effect the biggest part of that effort. Whereas others, people take that chance and get to do something really big, but obviously trying to make sure that engineers are not always, or team members in general, are not always optimizing for what's the safest bet to get a big hit versus like taking a chance and failing a bit as well along the way.
Absolutely great question, and not a very simple answer to this as well. Right? Luckily, I think places who've been through the test of time, like Google, where you are, being a great example of this, and Amazon being another one, they've they've had enough projects that actually that have gone through enough failures, because for so many things that never see the light of day, right? And so failure is not considered, like failure of a project is not considered something that should hold back a product manager or an engineer. And by the way, the way you'd actually measure, let's say, an engineer for their growth versus a product manager for their growth in these two scenarios may be slightly different. On the engineering side, it's actually a little simpler, because your code and the systems that you build are still more objective. And in fact, generally, the way calibration sessions go when you're doing performance reviews and stuff, good organizations are always trying to find opportunities for their talent, so that, let's say, as an engineer, and I'll get to product in a second too, but let's say as an engineer, you are somebody who can absolutely move to that next level, but your team doesn't have an interesting enough project that that's complex enough or that's scalable enough for for you to be able to get to that next level. Those organizations really focus on mobility to make sure that managers are trying to identify those projects across other teams and helping you get to those opportunities and not get you stuck within your team if your team doesn't actually have that opportunity available for you. So having been part of some of those organizations, I can say that on the engineering side, there's a huge focus on trying to create those opportunities for people. On the product side, it's actually very interesting, because the product failure or the business failure brings with it a lot of learnings. And so the question that ends up being, how did you actually take those learnings and apply it to that next project, or that next initiative, or something that was existing? And that really ends up being that measure. It usually is not the thing that will stop you from growth. Now, if you were repeating the same mistake again and again, that's a different issue, but generally that's not the case. And so the culture of these companies is built around testing and experimentation. And when you do an experiment, by the way, let's say if you were thinking about an A/B test, by definition, one of those variants is going to fail. You still put your best foot forward on both variants to see which one is going to succeed, but going in that one of them is going to fail, and you're not going to be penalized for that, because the learning that you get out of that is the most important thing, because you do have a winner now that comes out of it. And so from a product standpoint, as long as the person can actually show what those learnings were and show a good track record of being able to apply those to the next thing, they will always be celebrated in these organizations, and they'll have the opportunity to continue to move forward. Some of the best things come out of failures, man, because you get some great learnings that you can apply to that next one.
Yeah, totally. I mean, working with a bunch of small companies and having worked in a small company, I think the value of failing over and over again is sometimes not completely understood, especially for more typically large corporations, where a lot of these things like resource constraints and time and energy are not as constraining as they are in those smaller businesses. And so just thinking about go for it.
I was going to say, from a failure perspective, one of my previous companies, and this is before I joined them, but 10 Marks Education, they were first trying to create a product for for parents, where parents would subscribe to the product for their children, like for improving student outcomes. And that did not work out at all because they realized that that wasn't the market fit for them. And but out of that failure, they realized who the right target audience was, and that was the teachers, because it actually helped teachers, and they were the ones that adopted it in the classrooms, and then it spread like wildfire from there. But the initial experiment, or not, it wasn't even an experiment, right? But the initial product idea around getting parents to use it completely failed because it wasn't a fit. So, but the person who figured that out, he was the founder. Like, he got learnings out of it and applied it to the right thing, and then it just continued to thrive from there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'd love to just switch gears a bit and talk a little bit more about the individuals on these teams. So I think at the top there, we talked a little bit about how it's important to have a diversity of experience on the team. And I know that you spent a lot of time growing teams from very, very small to very, very large over and over and over again. So you have a pretty unique perspective on this, but I'm curious about how you think about, people at different stages in their life and how they can keep them engaged in the business. I've seen this in the past experiences for myself where, as businesses change and as businesses grow, especially, and grow very quickly, what you signed up for is not really what you get anymore out of the business, so to speak. So how do you think about that as like a leader in these organizations and kind of any tips and tricks there?
It's a very real scenario, and it's one that people often don't think about, both when they're recruiting or when they're joining a company. Right? They're solving for that particular stage what they're excited about, and that's totally okay. But I think being cognizant of the fact that companies will change, that their needs will change, individuals' needs will change, really helps people deal with this, in a long term. So I'll give you a few examples of where it's gone well and and where it's not, and some of the mindsets both from a company perspective as well as from an individual perspective. I'll start with one example that always stands out for me. It was I joined a startup at a point, and I inherited a team of about 5-6 engineers. And a couple of the engineers on that team did not want the team to grow more than 6 people because they said, "Oh, that's our sweet spot. That's where we have the most fun." And they were pretty adamant about not hiring more to the team because they figured, "No, we think we can do everything that we need to with about this size." That's not something that necessarily scales, right? Because if your company is going to be successful, it will grow, and your teams will grow as well. And so, out of those people, one of them eventually saw the advantages of growth and he actually started enjoying it and continued to grow with it. And one of the other people decided that it wasn't the place for them to be, and that they could go to another smaller team and still continue to have fun. So it's not a right or wrong thing. It's eventually getting that realization both from that individual's perspective and as well as the company's perspective also, that you want to figure out what people's motivations are. And if you can solve for those and align those with what the company needs, then it's great. And if not, then be very honest with them about it so that they can go and be happy somewhere else. There's absolutely nothing wrong with with that particular piece. The other thing around it is, let's say when you're growing an organization and you're trying to find people for the right stages, you have to be very cognizant around what you need at that particular point. And then continue to revisit those needs as a team as you continue to scale through those different stages. And the same applies for individuals as well. So when you're starting out with a very, very small team, you're not trying to create any management structures, any extra overheads. All you want is people who are extremely passionate about that particular problem and who are just who are going to be super passionate about just putting everything that they have in scaling that from the ground up. That's a very different mindset. That, by the way, that team is also going to be the one that's going to set the culture and tone for your company for the longest time. And so it's extremely important to figure out what the right makeup of that group is. But as you start scaling, you're going to be wearing multiple hats at that point. But as you start scaling, you're going to need to start getting into more expertise in certain areas. And then you will have to start bringing in people with those backgrounds and stuff. And these people, by the way, may not want to go and wear 10 different hats because they're very good at one particular thing. They enjoy doing that, and they may not enjoy doing 5 other things that other people were used to doing. And so as a company, and even as a team who's bringing in new people, having that expectation very clearly as you start bringing those folks in is key for them to be successful and for the team to also really be able to welcome them into the fold. If you expect them to do the same things that you're doing, it's not going to be successful, because by definition you're bringing them for different things and for different expertise. So that's a key thing. The other thing is looking at, you will have leaders for any particular function who may have a sweet spot for a particular life stage of an organization, and that may be getting it from that seed stage to a Series A or B company, or it may be somewhere a growth stage, or it may be somebody who really thrives at really, really large scale. There's no good or bad about it, right? The problems are just different in those stages. And so when you're bringing in somebody at, let's say, at that Series B or Series B stage, it's not a reasonable expectation that if this person has done, let's say, 3 Series B companies and they've always shifted after a few years of that, it's pretty likely that they will not be the person that will take you public as well. And that's totally okay for both them and you. But being cognizant about that coming in, and being cognizant that when you get to a particular life stage, if they're, if it stops being interesting for them or they're not as effective, having that conversation in a good way or getting that expectation set up, even from the very start, will make that relationship way more successful, versus hitting those bottlenecks at that point, then realizing, oh, why can't, or then looking at it in a negative way around, why can't this person do this now? Given the fact that they didn't do it the last 3 times either, and they have a sweet spot, and they actually got you to that particular point, right? So celebrate that, and then figure out what you need next and what they need next, versus trying to basically change them into something that they're not.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'd be curious, because I think the intent of that is obviously awesome, but the follow through and actually executing on that plan is I can imagine extremely difficult.
Yeah.
So what are you doing on a day-to-day basis to kind of make sure that both yourself, obviously with the people that you interact with, but also the people who work with you and work with other people at lower levels of the company are doing the same? What's the tactic there?
Yeah, so I'll dive more into actually building teams, and not necessarily talking about specific executive functions. But on the engineering and product teams, one of the things that can really help you be successful as you go through these life stages is to, as you're growing, starting to bring in new talent with different perspectives who have had a successful track record for those future stages that you're trying to get to, or the stage that you've just come at, but your team may not have as much experience. What that does is it starts giving the people in your team who may not have gone through those stages different perspectives, and some of them will start learning, from those new people that you're bringing in, and will start growing. Others will start realizing that either they don't want to grow, or this is no longer that much fun, and then being able to have those conversations in an honest way. A very simple example for us is one of our product teams last year went through a lot of growing change. This is a business that has grown significantly for us, and a lot of the people on that team had never really been through that scale before. And as we started scaling, we set very, very straightforward and clear expectations around where we were going as a team and as a company, what we would expect, and how we would actually help people grow as well. It's not just enough to set an expectation and say, we are going there and you just have to come. You also have to provide them the resources and training and guidance and mentorship around how they can actually get there. And this is where bringing in external, new talent that can be good mentors is a really useful way of doing things. Now, that said, it may seem logical that if you provide people the resources to grow, all of them would want to grow. That's never the case. There were people, on that team who said, no, we are not interested in being part of a larger organization and having all of these cross-functional, teams and partnerships, because we want to be able to do a bunch of these things ourselves. And a group of them over a period of time self-selected out, and they're happier in other places. And we tried to make that as positive an experience as possible, where we set clear expectations, and then we encourage people that where our path is, and if you want to be on this path, we will help you. But if the path is not for you, then it is totally okay to be happy somewhere else, and it's a positive thing and not a negative thing. What that resulted in is that while some people left, the people that stayed behind, which was a larger number, they were actually really happy because they could, they were aligned with where the team was going. They were getting the resources and tools and guidance to continue to grow. And a lot of them did grow, and took on management roles or leadership roles within the teams, and they saw their teams grow. But then they also saw that their friends and colleagues who they really liked, who didn't want to be part of this change and who weren't happy with this change, have gracefully went on to other things and are happy in those things. And so it still creates that positive environment. So I think being very deliberate about how you deal with this change is very important. Otherwise, what ends up happening is you'll have people that are unhappy because they want to operate in a certain way. You as a company have decided that you've moved past that point and you're not going to change it. But if you're not explicit about it, you can't necessarily go and solve that problem or make it clear for that other person that that this will not change, and they'll keep trying to change it and be unhappy.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a couple parts to that too, right? Because there will be people who will self-select out and leave the business if you set those expectations, but there will also be people who will want to stay but want growth opportunities and need help to get to that next level. So like how do you think about when's the right time, or how do you identify like individuals for employee development opportunities and stuff like that? Because I know that smaller businesses don't have the exact resources to spend on employee development across the whole entire company. What stages do you really think about like that being applicable to like individuals versus like everyone on the team? Thoughts around that?
I mean, in all honesty, no matter what teams may say, when you're very, very early stage, you're just not thinking about that. It's not a practical reality, right? Like when you're 5, 10, 15 people, it may happen accidentally, but I've almost never seen any org at that level thinking very explicitly about it. So you're generally bringing in people at those stages who are also not focused on that. They're very passionate about the problem that you're trying to solve. As you start getting as you start bringing in people at different levels, like let's say you're past that 20, 30 people point, you have a few managers on the team now as well. Now you're bringing in you don't just have your core team. This is a good time to start thinking about it. It doesn't mean that you start creating a lot of really structured frameworks around career ladders and so on when you're a 20, 30 people company, but at least in the one-on-ones and between the relationship between the managers and the individuals, start having some of those growth conversations. It may be as simple as just understanding what somebody's aspirations are, even if there is nothing formal around that. And then if you have a good understanding of that, then you can help them on that path to see how the company can provide opportunities, how other teams can provide opportunities, how a new project may actually fit in with that. Once you start getting a little bigger, that's where formalizing this becomes more and more important, and making sure that your managers are having good one-on-ones, they're having these growth conversations, and actually giving the ownership of somebody's career to that individual. And it's not a manager's responsibility to define a career path for you. Theirs is to help facilitate it, help you grow on that, remove roadblocks. But it's arming people in the best way to be able to define their journeys and and define their own career paths, and then helping them on that path, right? And so that takes a decent amount of work, which small orgs are not necessarily equipped to do. So as you start growing, being more deliberate about these things is very useful. Now, I'll give you a simple example, from some of my past lives. In larger companies, you have all of this available to you. So for example, at Google, you can go and get docs on pretty much any career level, any particular function, because they're all established. When you go to a smaller company, none of that exists. And you can't necessarily create that for the entire org in one day. So you start realizing, where do you have the critical mass that needs it the most? So in my, at Fandom, for example, over the last few years, the largest group was engineering, and it was it's easier to define that. And so we started as a pilot program for the company. We started defining more formal career ladders and paths, and and all that good stuff that you'll find in larger companies for engineering. And then within engineering also, we started with software engineering versus, let's say, SREs and QA. And then after one group, then we moved on to the next one and so on. And and eventually tech was the pilot, but then we did it for the entire company. But even there, you may have people in a function where you may only have one or two people. You're not going to define a 10-step ladder for 2 people, right? So you have to identify those pockets and then evolve as those grow. But being deliberate about it is the main thing. And you may have the benefit of having leaders in the company that have been through it, and so they can do it organically within the company, or bring in advisors and mentors, and or go get advice from other company, folks that have been through this in the same, in other companies in similar situations, and that'll help you create your own framework for whatever life stage you're at. But the key is to be deliberate about it.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, this will probably be our last question, so
Sure.
jump into this one more tiny topic here. But essentially, as you're thinking about that, like you're saying that you're kind of going from team to team, piloting with tech, and then moving on to others. How do you think about introducing titles and hierarchy into the company as you go through that process? Because I'm assuming that you would be kind of doing that as you go and start building those ladders, so to speak, right? What are your thoughts there?
That's a complicated one. I definitely have thoughts on it, but there's no one right way of doing this. Look, in the long run, I don't know of any org, regardless of how much they want to avoid titles and things like that, where they don't end up having levels and titles, because you're going to have people from in all sorts of different stages of their lives with different aspirations, and people want growth, and not, and while everybody's working for the growth of the company, people are also working for their individual growth. And so, and you're also, compensating people differently based on both performance and experience and so on. So as you grow larger, these things become pretty necessary. I think the challenge is when you're starting out. The key, in my personal opinion, is to build a culture where titles are not important. And remember, I'm not saying that you don't necessarily have titles or levels internally or whatever, but the key is that they don't matter. Like, one person's voice is never heard over another person because they're a staff engineer over a senior engineer, or a senior product manager over a product manager, right? Like, people should never even introduce themselves as those. That said, when you're hiring and bringing somebody in, you will, in all likelihood, in their offer letter have a title, or which is related to their market comp and so on. But you don't have to be advertising it and stuff. Now, with companies where you have founders, or at least a couple of people in the operating team that have been through these things a few times, they will start structuring it much early on, because they've seen all the problems that come in later when you don't have these. In a lot of words, it's a free-for-all. Titles are just distributed randomly based on what the candidate may want at that point. Comp is done differently. And so at some point you have to start standardizing it. You can get market comp data. You can start creating leveling guides. And my recommendation is to always try to create something that's more standardized to the industry, because it helps you recruit people in a good way. And then even for your own people, for your own teams, they're not, there's no expectation that somebody will always be with your company for their entire life. People move around, right? In large companies, people move around between groups. And in small companies, in places like Silicon Valley, people move around between companies. It's very acceptable, right? And so if you create more standardized frameworks, it's easy for you to bring talent in at the right comp levels, and it's easy for your people to be able to move out and and be able to state the work that they've done at the level that they had at your company be comparable to other places that they're going to. And so it ends up being a win-win for everybody. But again, it's an evolution. You're not going to take a 30-people company and create tons of titles and frameworks. But it's good to at least start with an internal framework. So as you're bringing people in, there's equity around comp and levels.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I know I said that was my last question, but I got one more for you. You mentioned at the top that You're a huge Lord of the Rings fan, and so am I. I have to ask you, what's your favorite movie?
Oh God, that's a tough one, man. Like, okay, so I'm going to answer this slightly differently and say, and maybe I'll come back to the movie as well. But like, I would say like between the regular movies and the extended versions, and then there's a super extended version, by the way. My favorite versions are the super extended versions for all three movies. They're all 4 hours plus. Uh, so it's
Where do I find this super extended version?
I think I bought them off of iTunes like a few years back. We were
Wow.
it was our Christmas break, and my wife made the mistake of saying, "Oh, maybe we should go through Lord of the Rings again." And my elder son and I said, "Only if we're going to get the extended versions." And I was trying to rent them, and I couldn't. I think the rentals were higher, and Apple had a deal on like the extended version, and these were awesome. These were 4 hours each, so so we ended up buying those, and I'm very happy about that. But there was a time where I think that the second one used to be my favorite for a while. But this one of the things around me is I usually don't hold favorites a lot. My opinions on these things change, and so honestly, like I've gone back and forth between like which one I like, depending on my mindset as to when I'm watching it. I like all of them enough that I've watched them enough times, right? So.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I've always been a number 2 fan, but recently I actually rewatched number 1 and forgot how, and was reminded of how good number 1 is as well. So I understand your ambivalence to state your winner.
Yeah, and then by the way, the extended version of number 1 is way better than the regular one.
I agree with that one. I agree with that.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to the new show that Amazon is building on this as well. So.
Yeah, same here. Totally. Do you know when that's supposed to come out? 2023?
No idea.
Something like that? Okay.
No idea.
Okay. Well, we'll give it back to you, Nabil, unless you have anything else you wanted to add, Adil.
No, thank you so much for the conversation, Sam. This was so much fun.
Yeah, thank you for having it. It was great to learn.
Well, thanks everybody, and thanks for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting these shows for the benefit of the community, and we definitely have another doozy planned for next month. It's around international product management, and it features a product lead at Rappi, Colombia's largest unicorn. So I'll be sharing more about that program in time. I'll email everybody the recording immediately after the program. And thank you so much for joining us today. That's a wrap, Eric, on the live stream. Thank you very much.